Walked into that hearing with one question, a single, precise, logically airtight question that the Secretary of State of the United States could not answer without either contradicting himself or admitting that the administration's entire legal framework for what it did in Venezuela was built on a standard that only applies in one direction. Before anyone reaches for the partisan exit, yes, Rand Paul is a Republican. That is exactly what makes this moment significant. This was not a Democrat attacking a Trump official. This was a member of the president's own coalition applying a constitutional test to an action his own administration carried out. And when the logic was reversed and pointed directly at the argument Rubio had been making, the argument collapsed in real time. Here is what was actually at stake in that room. The Trump administration sent a military operation into Venezuela. They bombed air defense positions, removed Nicolás Maduro by force, and imposed a naval blockade on the country. Then they told Congress it was not a war. They called it a law enforcement operation, a drug bust, a kinetic action. They argued that because the operation lasted only 4.5 hours, because casualties were minimal, because Maduro is a designated drug trafficker under U.S. indictment, congressional authorization under the War Powers Clause was not required. That is the argument Rubio had come to defend. Paul did not argue about Maduro. He did not debate Venezuela's elections or the merits of the operation. He did not challenge the outcome. He challenged the legal framework being used to justify it. And he did it with one question. If a foreign country did exactly what we did, bombed our air defense systems, captured and removed our president, blockaded our country, would that be an act of war? That is the universal test, the same standard applied to both sides of the equation. And it is the one question that the administration's legal theory cannot survive. Rubio's response told you everything. He immediately moved to duration. It only lasted 4.5 hours. He moved to casualties. Nobody died on either side. He described it as a law enforcement operation to capture someone indicted under U.S. law, someone we do not recognize as a legitimate head of state. He built a defense around every factor except the one Paul had actually asked about. Paul was not asking how long it took. He was not asking how clean it was. He was not asking whether Maduro deserved it. He was asking one thing. If another nation applied this exact same logic to us, if they decided our president was illegitimate, indicted him under their laws, and sent in a surgical military operation to remove him, would we call it war? Rubio had no clean answer to that, because there is no clean answer. Every person in that room understood that if a foreign military bombed American air defenses and extracted the American president in a 4.5-hour operation with no casualties, the United States would treat it as an act of war without a moment's hesitation. To claim otherwise would be absurd. And Rubio knew it, so he acknowledged it. He said, of course it would be an act of war. He said he would vote to declare war if someone invaded and took the American president. And in doing so, he handed Paul exactly what he needed. Because here is what that admission means. If the same action constitutes war when it is done to us, but does not constitute war when we do it to someone else, then the legal standard being applied is not a constitutional principle. It is a preference. It is a one-way argument. And one-way arguments, as Paul stated directly, that cannot be universally applied, that rebound against the person making them the moment you reverse the circumstances, are not arguments. They are justifications constructed after the fact to protect a decision already made. Paul called it a ruse, not once, multiple times. On the record, he said the drug bust framing is a ruse. He said redefining war as something other than war is a ruse. And then he explained precisely why, in terms that went beyond rhetoric and into constitutional structure. If the administration's legal standard requires waiting to see the scope, nature, and extent of hostilities before determining whether something is a war, then by definition, you cannot obtain congressional authorization before the war begins. You can only obtain it after bombs have been dropped, after troops are deployed, after the operation has concluded. And a vote taken after the fact is not Congress declaring war. It is Congress blessing a decision the executive has already made unilaterally. That is not the separation of powers. That is the legislature ratifying executive action and calling it oversight. The founders were explicit about this. The power to initiate war belongs to Congress. Not because they were naive about the demands of national security, but because they had lived under a system where a single executive could drag an entire nation into conflict on personal judgment. And they designed a government specifically to prevent that from happening again. The War Powers Clause is not a technicality. It is a structural safeguard built into the architecture of the Constitution. And the administration's argument that an operation can be a war for everyone else but not for Congress dissolves the safeguard entirely. Paul made this point with one of the most piercing observations of the exchange. He noted that the administration's own Office of Legal Counsel opinion cited casualties as a relevant factor in determining whether something constitutes a constitutional war. The implication being, if not enough people died, it does not rise to the level requiring congressional action. Paul's response to this was direct. The 58,000 Americans who died in Vietnam might be enough for them to call that a war. But here is the problem. If you are waiting for the casualty count to determine whether a war is a war, the war has already been going on for some time. By the time you know the scope, nature, and extent, it is too late to vote on initiation. Congress is left voting on continuation, not authorization. That distinction is not semantic. It is the entire point. Then Rubio fell back on the argument of national interest. The United States will always act in its national interest. America will always protect itself. And Paul did not disagree with that. He said explicitly that he agreed, of course, the United States will act in its national interest. Of course, it will defend itself and protect its people. That is not the question. The question is whether national interest is a legal standard. It is not. It is a political judgment. Every government on earth, including governments the United States regards as adversaries, claims to be acting in its national interest when it deploys military force. Russia said it was acting in its national interest in Ukraine. China says it whenever it conducts operations in the South China Sea. National interest is not a constraint on executive power. It is the justification every executive reaches for when it wants to act without constraint. Rubio was not defending a constitutional principle. He was defending a blank check. And when Rubio pivoted to the legitimacy question, arguing that Maduro was not really elected, that he does not recognize him as a legitimate head of state, Paul turned that argument back on him with precision. The moment you accept that a president can bypass congressional authorization because he does not recognize the legitimacy of a foreign leader, you have opened a door with no frame. What stops another country from applying the same logic to the United States? What happens when a foreign government, citing disputed elections, contested results, contested legitimacy, decides that the American president is not a real president and acts accordingly? Paul noted that American politicians themselves have questioned the legitimacy of American elections. Our own president said his predecessor was not legitimately elected. Hillary Clinton said in 2016 that Trump's election was not legitimate. These are not idle arguments. They are the same category of argument being used to justify removing Maduro. And if that category of argument is sufficient to authorize unilateral military force without congressional approval, The door does not just open for the United States. It opens for everyone. Paul brought up Benjamin Netanyahu's indictment by the International Criminal Court. He noted that the United States, correctly in his view, refuses to recognize the ICC's authority over American officials or allied leaders. We would never allow an international body to indict our president and have him arrested on foreign soil. We object to the same being done to Netanyahu. But the logic the administration is applying to Venezuela is structurally identical to the logic the ICC claims to be applying to Netanyahu. If a legitimate indictment under a governing legal framework is sufficient authorization for a forced removal operation, and if the legitimacy of the leader being removed is determined by the country doing the removing, then we have not established a legal standard. We have established a doctrine of force justified by whoever is strong enough to apply it. That is not constitutional governance. That is might as right, with legal language layered on top. Paul did not say this to defend Maduro. He said it to expose where the argument leads when you follow it to its logical conclusion. And where it leads is to a world where the constraints on executive war-making are not legal, but practical. Where presidents do not ask Congress for authorization. They do what they can get away with. And they define it as something other than war to avoid accountability. Rubio's honest moment came near the end of the exchange, and it was the most revealing thing he said. He acknowledged, essentially, that the United States acts in its national interest and will protect that interest with force when necessary, and that the legal framing around that action is secondary to the outcome. He was not saying the law does not matter, but the structure of his argument made clear that when national interest and legal constraint come into conflict, the administration resolves that tension in favor of national interest and adjusts the legal framing afterward. Paul named it clearly. The arguments are empty. The drug bust framing is empty. The not a war framing is empty. They are constructed to reach a predetermined conclusion. And he said that what we are really saying, stripped of the legal language, is we do it because we have the power to do it, and we would not allow anyone to do it to us. That is honest. It is also the definition of a standard that cannot be universally applied. And standards that cannot be universally applied are not constitutional principles. They are exceptions carved out for the powerful. The broader significance of this exchange extends well beyond Venezuela and well beyond this administration. If Congress does not assert its authority to authorize the initiation of military force, if senators and representatives accept the administration's framing that operations below some undefined casualty threshold or duration threshold do not require a vote, then they are not just ceding ground on one decision. They are permanently redefining the balance of power between the executive and the legislature on questions of war. Every future president inherits that expanded authority, Democratic or Republican. Every future administration gets to use the precedent established here. Every future Secretary of State gets to stand before a Senate committee and say that 4.5 hours and minimal casualties does not rise to the constitutional definition of war, and point to what this administration did as the established precedent. That is how power expands. Not through a single dramatic rupture, but through accumulated precedents, each one building on the last, each one narrowing what Congress is permitted to question. Until the legislature is not a co-equal branch of government, but an audience watching decisions being made elsewhere. Paul understands this. His argument was not about this operation. It was about the standard. It was about what happens to the constitutional architecture when this kind of reasoning becomes normalized and goes unchallenged. Rubio never answered the universal test cleanly. He never said, under these exact circumstances, reversed, applied to us, it would not be war. He could not say that because the sentence would be false and visibly absurd to anyone listening. So he kept reframing. He kept narrowing. He kept finding new factors to emphasize duration, casualties, the status of the removed individual, the legitimacy question, the national interest argument, anything except a direct answer to the question Paul had asked. That evasion is itself the answer. When a senior official cannot apply his own administration's legal standard symmetrically, when the test only passes in one direction, the standard is not a legal principle. It is a justification. And justifications constructed to protect one outcome applied selectively, abandoned the moment you reverse the circumstances, are exactly what Paul said. They are a ruse. He said it on the record. He said it to the Secretary of State of the United States. He said it as a member of the president's own party. And Rubio had no answer that held up under the pressure when Paul stated that the United States is in violation of both the spirit and the letter of the Constitution by bombing a capital, blockading a country, and removing its leadership without a congressional vote. That is not a partisan accusation. That is a structural argument grounded in the text and intent of the document the administration swears to uphold. Rubio's response was that the person removed was not legitimately elected. Paul's response was that Venezuela has had the same internal arguments about legitimacy that the United States has had, and we would not accept a foreign power using those arguments to justify removing our president by force. The logic does not survive contact with the universal test. The mask slipped in that hearing room. Not dramatically, not with a confession or a document or an admission of wrongdoing, but in the quiet, unavoidable moment when the Secretary of State acknowledged that the same action, clean, swift, low casualty, would absolutely be an act of war if directed at the United States. That acknowledgement is now on the record. And records, unlike talking points, do not get redefined after the fact. The questions Paul placed before that committee do not dissolve when the hearing ends. They will be cited in future debates about war powers. They will be referenced when the next administration, this one or the next one, seeks to deploy force without congressional authorization and reaches for the same legal framing. They will be available to every senator who needs to explain why a vote was or was not required. The constitutional argument Paul made in that room was not about Maduro. It was about whether the United States is going to maintain the structure its founders built. The one that says no single person decides when this country goes to war. That structure is either intact or it is not. And based on what happened in that hearing room, the administration's position is that it is negotiable, provided the operation is fast enough, clean enough, and politically convenient enough. That is not a constitutional standard. That is a preference. And preferences, unlike constitutional text, shift with whoever is in power. If you want to follow how this develops, the legal challenges, the congressional responses, the next time this administration reaches for the same framing to justify the next operation, subscribe now and turn on notifications. This is not an isolated moment. It is a precedent being established in real time, and the next chapter is already being written. Leave a comment below. Do you believe Congress should have voted before this operation began? Because based on what you just watched, the Secretary of State of the United States does not think the Constitution required it. And a Republican senator just made the case on the record that he is. What you just heard in that exchange sounds simple on the surface, but it was actually one of the most precise constitutional challenges delivered in a Senate hearing in years. It started with a single question from Rand Paul directed at Marco Rubio. The question itself was stripped of politics, stripped of ideology, and reduced to a pure test of logic.
Hello, I'm Rachel Maddow.
Every day, we research and break down major stories, from White House developments in Congress to elections, Supreme Court decisions, international relations, and economic trends, so you can understand what's really happening beyond the headlines. But here on YouTube, you're only seeing part of a story. For deeper analysis, exclusive videos, and behind-the-scenes insights, join our community on Patreon. The link is in the description or chat. Here on Patreon, members get exclusive content, deeper analysis, and behind-the-scenes insights that we don't share anywhere else. Paul asked something that every person watching could immediately understand. If a foreign country bombed American air defense systems, captured the President of the United States, removed him from the country, and then imposed a naval blockade, would that be considered an act of war? Rubio's first instinct was to explain the situation differently. He pointed to the circumstances of the operation being discussed. He emphasized that the operation lasted only about 4.5 hours. He stressed that it was described as a law enforcement action aimed at capturing someone who had been indicted under U.S. law and was the subject of a massive bounty. He also noted that the United States does not recognize that individual as a legitimate head of state. But Paul was not asking about legitimacy. He was not asking about whether the target deserved it. He was not asking about how long the operation lasted or how many casualties occurred. He was asking about the principle. If the same thing happened to the United States, would we consider it an act of war? Rubio tried to frame the situation around operational details, duration, casualties, the legal status of the person targeted, the fact that it was described as a law enforcement operation rather than a military campaign. But Paul kept pulling the discussion back to the central point. Reverse the situation. Flip the scenario around. Imagine another country deciding that the American president was illegitimate, indicting him under their laws, and sending a surgical strike team to remove him. Would the United States treat that as war? Everyone in the room knew the answer to that question before Rubio even spoke. Eventually, Rubio acknowledged it. If a foreign nation invaded the United States and removed the American president by force, he said he would absolutely consider that an act of war. And the moment he said that, the entire logic of the administration's argument began to collapse. Because Paul's test was simple. If an action counts as war when it happens to us, but does not count as war when we do it to someone else, then the standard being used is not a constitutional principle, it is a preference. That distinction matters because the United States Constitution is extremely clear about who has the authority to initiate war. The power to declare war belongs to Congress, not the President, not the State Department, Congress. That structure exists for a reason. The founders of the United States designed the system specifically to prevent a single executive from dragging the country into conflict without the consent of the legislative branch. The administration's defense of the operation rested on a different interpretation. Officials argued that the action in question did not meet the constitutional threshold for war. They framed it as a limited operation, short in duration, minimal in casualties, targeted at a specific individual who had already been indicted by the United States. Under that logic, congressional authorization was not required. Paul's argument was that this framework only works if you apply it in one direction. If another country used the exact same reasoning to justify attacking the United States, no American official would accept that explanation. Imagine another nation saying something like this. The operation only lasted 4 hours. Very few people were harmed. The person we captured was someone we consider illegitimate under our laws. Would the United States say, well, that sounds like a law enforcement action? Of course not. The United States would treat it as an act of war immediately. That is the universal test Paul was applying. A legal standard must be capable of working both ways. If it collapses the moment you reverse the roles, then it is not really a standard at all. Rubio tried to bring the conversation back to national interest. The United States, he argued, must act to protect its interests and its security. Paul did not dispute that. He acknowledged that every country acts in what it believes is its national interest. But national interest is not a legal rule. It is a political justification. Every government in the world claims to act in its national interest when it uses force. Russia says it when it moves troops. China says it when it asserts control over disputed waters. Governments everywhere invoke national interest as the ultimate justification. That does not answer the constitutional question. The constitutional question is whether the executive branch can use military force without congressional authorization and simply define that action as something other than war. Paul argued that once you start redefining military actions to avoid the word war, the War Powers Clause loses its meaning. If the president can launch operations, drop bombs, remove foreign leaders, and impose blockades without asking Congress, then the legislative branch is no longer deciding when the country enters a conflict. It is reacting afterward. And that distinction is crucial. The Constitution gives Congress the power to authorize war before it begins. If the decision is made first and Congress votes later, then Congress is not declaring war. It is approving a decision already made by the executive branch. Paul made another point that resonated throughout the room. The administration's legal analysis suggested that the scope and nature of hostilities matter when determining whether something counts as war. Casualty numbers were cited as one of the factors. Paul responded with a historical example. If you wait to see how many people die before deciding whether something counts as a war, then by definition, the war has already begun. The decision to use force has already been made. Congress is no longer authorizing the conflict. It is deciding whether to continue it. That was never the system the founders intended. Rubio also argued that the legitimacy of the targeted leader mattered. The United States does not recognize that individual as the legitimate leader of the country involved. Paul turned that argument around as well. Once you accept the idea that a president can bypass congressional authorization by declaring a foreign leader illegitimate, you open a door that cannot easily be closed. Other nations could use the exact same logic. If a foreign government claims that the American president was not legitimately elected, does that give them the right to intervene militarily? The United States would reject that argument immediately. Paul even pointed out that debates over election legitimacy are not unique to other countries. American political leaders themselves have questioned the outcomes of U.S. elections in the past. If disputes over legitimacy become the standard for military intervention, the implications stretch far beyond one operation in one country. That is why Paul described the administration's reasoning as a ruse. Not once, but multiple times during the hearing. In his view, the legal arguments were constructed after the fact to justify a decision that had already been made. Strip away the legal language, he argued, and the logic becomes very simple. The United States acted because it had the power to act, and it assumes no one else would dare do the same thing to it. That may be an honest description of geopolitical reality, but it is not the constitutional framework the United States claims to follow. The larger issue raised in that hearing goes far beyond one specific operation or one administration. If Congress allows this interpretation to stand unchallenged, it effectively expands presidential authority over military action for every future president, Republican or Democrat. Once a precedent is established, it rarely disappears. Future administrations point to it as justification for similar. The scope of executive power expands gradually through accumulated precedents rather than dramatic constitutional changes. That is why Paul framed his argument around the principle rather than the specific event. His concern was not only about what had happened, it was about the standard being created for the future. Rubio never fully answered the universal test. He acknowledged that the same action directed at the United States would be treated as war. But he continued to argue that the operation in question did not meet the threshold requiring congressional authorization. That contradiction is now part of the official record of the hearing. And once something enters the record, it becomes part of the legal and political debates that follow. The next time an administration uses force without congressional approval, this exchange will likely be cited again. Senators will point to the question Paul asked and the answer Rubio gave. Because the issue at stake was never just about one operation. It was about whether the constitutional structure that divides war powers between Congress and the president still functions the way it was designed. That question did not end when the hearing adjourned. It is going to keep coming up every time the United States uses military force without a vote from Congress. And judging by the intensity of that exchange, the debate over who decides when America goes to war is far from settled. Hello, I'm Rachel Maddow. Every day, we research and break down major stories, from White House developments in Congress to elections, Supreme Court decisions, international relations, and economic trends, so you can understand what's really happening beyond the headlines. But here on YouTube, you're only seeing part of a story. For deeper analysis, exclusive videos, and behind-the-scenes insights, join our community on Patreon. The link is in the description or chat. Here on Patreon, members get exclusive content, deeper analysis, and behind-the-scenes insights that we don't share anywhere else.